Air pollution is not a new phenomenon. By the mid-1600s, London's air had reached the point that it attracted the attention of one of the greatest minds of the time, John Evelyn. In 1661, he published a book entitled Fumifugium, or The Inconvenience of the Air and Smoke of London Dissipated. The pamphlet was a call to clean up the air of the City of London. It described the effects of air pollution caused by coal burning on the population of London, and he wrote, "In London, her inhabitants breathe nothing but an impure and thick mist, accompanied by a fuliginous and filthy vapour, which renders them obnoxious to 1,000 inconveniences, corrupting the lungs and disordering the entire habit of their bodies, so that catarrhs, phthisics, coughs and consumptions rage more in this one city than the whole earth besides." Evelyn suggested that burning wood instead of coal would be less harmful to the lungs and recommended relocating some of London's most polluting industries outside of the city. With increasing industrialization, there was a string of parliamentary acts in the mid-19th century designed to do something about the polluting effects of industrial and domestic smoke. London was infamous for its combination of smoke and fog, combined in the word smog. For this reason, London earned the nickname the Big Smoke. All major cities suffered from smoke pollution, and Edinburgh's nickname Old Reekie refers partly to the sanitary situation of the town as well as smoke pollution. London became quite infamous for its smogs, and many visitors came to see the capital in the fog, not least the artist Monet. He painted the atmospheric conditions and sunsets caused by the smog many times during his visits in the years between 1899 and 1901. A recent study has shown that Monet's paintings of the Houses of Parliament were not created from his imagination, but that these were firmly based on actual observations made during the artist's visits to London. It is perhaps the earliest visual record of the great smogs of London. Notwithstanding its artistic qualities, the London smog could literally be a killer. A week of smog in 1873 killed over 700 people in London. However, the largest air pollution disaster in Britain was the Great London Smog of 1952. On December the 4th, 1952, an anticyclone settled over London. The wind dropped, the air grew damp, and an inversion layer trapped the air, which received smoke of 3.5 million chimneys and many industrial smokestacks. Visibility dropped to a few meters, and smoke levels rose 300%, and the sulfur dioxide levels rose by 700%. It is therefore hardly surprising that this led to around 4,000 deaths. The peak in the number of deaths coincided with the peak in both smoke and sulfur dioxide pollution levels. In the aftermath of the Great London Smog of 1952, the government passed the two Clean Air Acts of 1956 and 1968. The aim of the acts was to control domestic sources of smoke pollution by introducing so-called smokeless zones and control industrial sources of pollution by the use of tall chimneys for waste gas dispersal. The reduction of domestic and industrial coal burning and the use of smokeless fuels led to a reduction in the levels of emissions of smoke and sulfur dioxide, which is one of the main contributors to acid rain. Between 1970 and 1994, emissions fell by 60%. Although these measures worked reasonably well, the smog problem disappeared from London and other European cities due to a change in fuel. The switch to gas heating and also using gas for electricity generation made this kind of smog a thing of the past. However, with the rise of car traffic, we got a new kind of smog, photochemical smog. This kind of smog is caused by carbohydrates, which are produced by the millions of cars driving around. This is the famous Los Angeles smog.
Mexico City, Mexico. Population 19.5 million. It is the 10th largest populated city in the world. Like many other large cities across the world, it faces problems with pollution. Mexico City started rapidly industrializing in the 1960s. With this industrialization came a huge influx of population. Mexico City's population problem became evident as early as 1985. Various newspaper articles brought up this problem. Problems ranged from birds dying in large numbers to people suffering from lead, copper, and mercury poisoning due to the polluted air. Even during the winter, the school day had been pushed to start at 10 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. The government hoped that the extra 2 hours would allow smog in the air to clear away before children went outside. At the time, however, the government took little action, saying it was only a potential health problem. In most cities, pollution is able to escape since hot air rises and cold air sinks, allowing air to be circulated. However, the airborne particles of pollution do not have anywhere to go. To make the problem even worse, when the temperatures are low, a layer of cold air lies atop the pollutants, trapping them in the city. This is known as thermal inversion. Some of the main airborne pollutants include sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon dioxide, as well as ozone, which is considered to be dangerous when at ground level. But there is yet another chemical that is also dangerous to the people living in the city. It is called PM10 of particulate matter. This particulate matter comes from anything from burning wood to laying in a new road, and it is more dangerous than ozone. While pollution problems were visible as early as 1986, Mexico City's problems persist today. What if you were a child growing up there? How healthy would you be? Health problems, particularly for the young and elderly, range from allergy-like effects to more serious illnesses such as asthma. However, not all hope is lost. The government has put programs in place that are believed to help remedy the city, such as ProAire and PICA. ProAire, and the 3 programs that have followed since, try to show the citizens of Mexico City more environmentally friendly ways to live than being generally aware of their surroundings. There are other initiatives as well, including educational programs in women's centers and schools. Communities are trying to learn what the pollution is about and how they can help. Although Mexico City has had a difficult fight with pollution for many years, there is hope for the future. While pollution cannot be rid of in its entirety, every little contribution helps.
From VOA Learning English, welcome to the Economics Report in Special English. China has been struggling to deal with record levels of smog over Beijing. Recently, officials in several Chinese cities announced plans to trade carbon credits as a way to reduce air pollution. For many years, China considered economic growth more important than the environment. The nation remains hungry for energy, but it has also become the world's biggest producer of carbon gases. Beijing's smoggy days have made international news. Small particles in the air reduce visibility and threaten public health. Smog has been a concern in the city for years, but a sharp rise in pollution levels in January led to sharp criticism from many Chinese. Pollution from coal-burning power centers and factories is a big part of the problem. Now, officials hope to control industrial air pollution by creating systems to trade carbon credits. The trading systems or platforms would enable companies to receive credits for lowering greenhouse gas emissions. The credits can then be traded. The goal of these market-based platforms is to get businesses to invest in clean technology. Markets for carbon credits are expected to open this year in 7 cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin. Officials say the government has decided to start with pilot programs because carbon trading is something new. China wants to launch a national carbon trading program by 2016. Still, public pressure continues building on the government to find an answer to thick air pollution. Wu Changhua is with the Climate Group. She says the Chinese people are looking at more than jobs. They want a better environment, too. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
There is a perfect storm of concerns about air pollution in London in 2012. Annual levels of nitrogen dioxide, a toxic gas, are more than twice World Health Organization guideline levels and legal limits near busy streets like this one. In 2010, concentrations of nitrogen dioxide in London were the highest of any capital city in Europe and comparable with levels in Beijing before it took action before the 2008 Olympics. Air pollution matters. The Mayor of London has estimated 4,267 deaths attributable to long-term exposure to invisible air pollution in 2008. That number is comparable with the 4,075 deaths attributable to short-term exposure to visible air pollution in the Great Smog of 1952, when we knew nothing about the health impacts of long-term exposure to air pollution. Only smoking causes more early deaths than long-term exposure to air pollution. More than a year ago, the Olympic Delivery Authority admitted that the Olympic route network and associated transport arrangements would cause temporary and local breaches of air pollution laws. Now, there are 2 ways traditionally to mitigate those impacts. The first is an odd and even number plate ban, as in Beijing in 2008, and the other approach is the big scare tactic, which plays mind games with drivers. Lord Coe wrote to Clean Air in London in 2008, setting out a bold and positive vision for air quality during the London 2012 Olympics. Frankly, he and the Olympic Delivery Authority have done everything possible within their powers to deliver on that positive vision. But so far, they've been let down by the mayor and the government, who have chosen to use pollution suppressants along busy roads by monitoring stations and the big scare tactic backed by hundreds and perhaps thousands of local traffic restrictions. These are likely to infuriate Londoners and others during the Games. The Olympic organisers have made London ready for the world. But what we need now from the mayor and the government are proper warnings about congestion and air pollution, particularly if we have a smog episode like 2003 or 2006. London should be leading the world in tackling air pollution as it did after the Great Smog of 1952.
Just as you wouldn't drink a glass of dirty water, you wouldn't choose to breathe in dirty air. So what if you could see the air in such a way that you could know how much pollution you and your family are exposed to? How would it affect your lifestyle, how you travel, how you live, or even where you live? Well, that's what I've developed. A machine that allows you to see the pollution all around you. My name is Mark Richards. I've got a passion for physics, and I've found through the machine I've developed a way of applying it to something both meaningful and practical. But like most inventions, it starts off as a piece of research. I'm using this clean water to represent clean air. And when I shine a beam of light through the water, it goes through, fairly uninhibited. However, if there are pollutants present, then that pollutant will absorb some of the light. And this is because when light hits a molecule, that molecule will absorb some and transmit the rest. As a result, the beam gets weaker. I can use this principle to measure the amount of pollution in this water. If I was to conduct a similar experiment in the air, most pollutants are not visible. They absorb very little visible light. Luckily, many pollutants absorb light outside of the visible range, ultraviolet light. Instead of visible light, I can direct an ultraviolet light beam through the air, and any chemicals which are present will absorb specific wavelengths. Each pollutant has its own signature in the ultraviolet region. The resultant beam is measured with something called a spectrometer. I've aligned the optics. I've also connected the source and the spectrometer. Finally, I've run some air through this chamber and also injected some pollutants. So let's look at the results. The large peaks here are due to sulfur dioxide, an important pollutant. It's mainly produced by heavy industry and also diesel engines. You can see these smaller peaks which are due to nitric oxide emitted by petrol engines. This setup actually allows me to detect many different gases simultaneously. And not only that, we can actually measure how much of each gas is present. So, now I can see pollution, which is great, but this is just an experiment in the lab. The challenge is how I can adapt this for use in the real world. I helped to set up a company with engineers and business people, and the aim was to develop a machine that measures pollution that is portable. The optical path of the ultraviolet light beam has to be quite long, so I use a series of UV reflective mirrors to create multiple reflections so that we can make the unit short enough to carry. In order to complete the unit, it requires a clever computing algorithm and supporting electronics, that allows us to take measurements every second. Now this makes it ideal for mobile sensing. So I'm here at the inside the quad at Imperial College, and I was just actually checking the pollution levels. Seems pretty good so far. Sulfur dioxide is near enough 0 parts per billion. Nitrogen dioxide, 28 parts per billion. The legal limit is about 105. So these numbers are incredibly encouraging. But of course, we might see dramatic changes on the road side. Junction here. As you can see, multiple lanes of traffic in several directions. Let's have a look what the numbers say. Well, both nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide, they're both above 100 parts per billion. But the key thing here is that at traffic lights, whilst cars are idling their engines, they're not being overworked, but when the lights change, the cars will start to rev their engines. And as a result, the emission levels will start to spike quite dramatically. I've managed to couple the unit with GPS, which means I can now map pollution readings to exact locations. And when you combine this with the fact that I can measure every second, it means that I can now generate a pollution map, a bit like a weather map. Furthermore, you can actually update this map in real time. That means as the pollution changes around you, you can see the changes straight away. So if you're an asthma sufferer, for example, you can actually have a look at this map and decide where to go or when to go. Okay, so this is the data.
Yes.
Great. Can we go to this? Is this the southwest corner that we were at? Because
yeah, I think so.
So this is the quad at Imperial College where we started. If we start to include nitrogen dioxide, now we can see a huge spike at the junction.
It's really a high pollution level.
Yeah, this spike's interesting actually, because this was when we were near 3 coaches. One of them was idling their engine, and just that one coach idling its engine has caused this huge spike here. Now, I've just put the unit in a weatherproof case. This means I can stick it on top of my car, which means I can cover a much wider area. And I can go on to map the whole of London like this, driving around seeing how pollution varies from area to area, street by street. The implications for this technology are huge. In the UK alone, over 50,000 deaths are attributed to air pollution each year. There's increasing public concern, and with this machine, we can really find out how bad pollution is for the first time. The bottom line is, if you knew more about air quality, you could build a better environment around you. If you knew more about the pollution levels around a school during the school run, it might influence parents' travel habits. So, with my physics, I've managed to develop something real, something useful, but more importantly, something that helps to improve the quality of life for my family by allowing them to see the air they breathe.
So some of the strongest voices in the fight against biomass incineration are not always environmentalists, but actually members of the health community. So unlike other renewable energy sources like solar or wind, biomass incineration does require a smokestack. So we have one prestigious organization of medical professionals after another. They're coming out and they're disagreeing with the idea that clean energy can come out of a smokestack. We have the American Lung Association opposing the construction of new biomass incinerators. They're worried about the impact on children, older adults, and people with lung disease. The Massachusetts Medical Society is worried as well. Hardly a bunch of radical tree huggers. They're citing unacceptable risk to the public's health. Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition is concerned in particular about PAHs and dioxin, known carcinogens. Physicians for Social Responsibility opposes the construction of biomass power incinerators. Hampton District Medical Society, same thing. They oppose the construction of the 5 new proposed facilities for Massachusetts. Once again, we see unacceptable health risk. North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians, numerous and serious adverse health consequences. We have some doctors here with some of their specific feelings on the matter. Dr. William Sammons from Massachusetts, direct negative impact on the health of our nation's children. He is a pediatrician, and he has been traveling around the U.S. actually talking to lawmakers and other folks who's so concerned about this issue. Asthma specialist Dr. Ron Saff of Florida believes that biomass incineration causes asthma, heart attacks, cancer, and shortens lives. Mark McDermott from, I believe he's in Williamstown.
Yeah.
Pediatrician, his quote there is that air pollution will lead to disease. He cites in particular the particulate matter, which I'll get into in a moment. Here's only a few of the toxic pollutants and their potential health impacts emitted from the McNeil biomass power incinerator in Burlington, Vermont. So we have nitrogen oxides there with their impacts on heart and lung, carbon monoxide, heart and lung. You get the picture there. You can go to a website called planethazard.com and you can find out your state and your county's biggest polluters. The state of Vermont's #1 polluter is the McNeil Biomass Power Incinerator. The data comes from the 2002 Environmental Protection Agency National Emission Inventory Database. So these are the chemicals that are released by that particular incinerator. And I can't tell you how harmful each of the individual levels are, but it's pretty shocking to know that this supposed clean energy source emits, I believe it's 79 pollutants.
What are the numbers?
Oh, sorry. Yes, they are pounds per year.
Okay.
This is just burning wood.
Right. That facility does not burn construction and demolition debris. It burns clean wood.
The first one, carbon monoxide, is what? 1 million?
Yeah.
Yes.
Pounds, these are
Something.
pounds per year.
1 million
per
pounds.
year. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Doesn't count carbon dioxide.
No, carbon dioxide isn't on this because they don't necessarily measure.
It's the
wood.
main product they have.
Yeah.
Water.
So this is the biggest issue, is the particulate matter. It's one of the most harmful pollutants, and multiple studies insist there are no safe levels of exposure to particulates. The American Cancer Society states that, according to their studies. And the EPA, I'm just going to read a quote from the EPA, numerous scientific studies have linked particle pollution exposure to a variety of problems, including increased respiratory symptoms such as irritation of the airways, coughing or difficulty breathing, decreased lung function, aggravated asthma, development of chronic bronchitis, non-fatal heart attacks, and premature death in people with heart or lung disease. So there's particulate matter 10 and particulate matter 2.5, and this is their size in comparison to a human hair. And it's particulate matter 2.5 that can get deep into your lungs, into your bloodstream, even into your organs. And you can't see it. So they say, look, there's nothing coming out of the smokestack. It doesn't mean it's not harmful.
Hello and welcome to the AUC's Morning Newsroom. This is your host, Jennifer, and here are the main news stories for today. First up, we are heading to Egypt, where Cairo is now officially the most polluted city in the world, where there are 168 particulate matter per cubic meter of air. We now head to our reporter in Cairo to hear the opinion of 2 taxi drivers on the situation of air pollution in Egypt.
انت شايف ان نسبة التلوث في القاهرة عالية، فانت شايف ازاي احنا ممكن نقلل من الموضوع ده؟
والله أول حاجة العربيات القديمة بتطلع دخان كتير جدا في الجو. فممكن لو بالذات التكوسة اللي هي القديمة أوي دي كانوا فتحوا شوية التجديد بتاع العربيات وكده، يعني التكوسة. ففي فعلا دلوقتي لغاية دلوقتي تكوسة في البلد اللي بتطلع دخانة كتير والحاجات دي.
طب انت شايف ان في حاجة انت ممكن تعملها انت من نفسك عشان تقلل من موضوع التلوث ده؟
والله كاحنا بني ادمين ما نقدرش نعمل حاجه، هي الحكومه دلوقتي هي اللي ماسكه كل حاجه. فهم ممكن يعملوا ممكن يفتحوا للناس ديت المشروع تاني اللي هي بتاع التاكسي الجديد. وفي مصانع كتير جدا برضه في البلد بتطلع ادخنه وزي مصانع الاسمنت والحاجات دي. فممكن برضه دي برضه يشوفوا لها حل، يعني ادخنه على اي مكان بعيد، صحراء، اي حاجه.
طب وانت شايف ان احنا ممكن الموضوع ده ياخد كتير عشان القاهرة من اكتر المدن؟
طبعا هياخد كتير جدا لان احنا مفيش حاجه عندنا تبقى بسهوله. ممكن برضه لو عايزين نخليها بسهوله تبقى بسهوله. ف يعني نفسي تبقى الحاجه تبقى باحسن وكده يعني.
انت شايف ايه اللي بيخلي العربية تطلع عوادم؟
والله في بعض عربيات استهلكت خلاص، عمرها الافتراضي انتهى، فالحكومة عملت مشروع كويس بس طبعا واقف حاليا.
هو ايه؟ أنهي مشروع؟
مشروع تسليم العربية وبتستلم غيرها بالقسط. فالمشروع كان كويس واتعمل بس طبعا دلوقتي متوقف. وبعدين في مصانع المفروض ان الحكومة تعدلها، يعني تقعد مع اصحابها وتعدلها. ان في مصانع الطوب اللي بيولعوا فيه بالمزيوت ده من عوامل برضو اللي بتخلي في بيئة في الجو وتلوث جامد.
طب انت لو انا قلت لك طب القاهرة من اكتر المدن اللي فيها تلوث، انت شايف ايه اللي انت ممكن تغيره من نفسك انت؟
والله اللي اقدر اغيره من نفسي اني الشيء اللي معايا لو في حاجة بتعمل تلوث لازم اعدل منها.
طب والسجاير طيب ايه دور الحكومة طيب؟
دور الحكومة عاملة ارشادات لتبطيل السجاير، وزارة الصحة. بس للأسف الشعب المصري اتعود على الشيء ده خلاص. ففي حاجات بالنسبة للتلوث كمان ان الحكومة عملت ادوار كتيرة، بس برضو الرق يرجع لصحابات المصانع.
Air pollution is a hazard to our health and makes us prone to stroke, heart disease, lung cancer and chronic respiratory diseases. But what could people in Egypt do to help decrease air pollution? We move over to our environmentalist, Dr. Bob.
First of all, recycling has to be introduced to people in Egypt because recycling actually aids in conserving energy, which in turn lowers production emissions. As the two drivers said, the government has responsibilities towards decreasing air pollution. A call center could be set up where smoking vehicles could be reported and fined. They could, as mentioned, reopen the old taxi exchange program where old taxis are disposed of in favor of the new white taxis.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. I'll have to interrupt you because we're going live from the Prime Minister's house as he's joined in on the campaign to rid Egypt of pollution. Mr. Prime Minister, how can Egyptians take further measures in ensuring the cleanliness of the air?
They could use easy measures in ensuring so, such as using a bike in the streets, and the government will make sure of making bike-friendly strips on the side of roads. Carpooling is also a viable option, as well as trying to buy products with less packaging also helps due to the amount of pollution resulting from plastic production. And since there are products available that are environmental friendly, I urge citizens to use and consume them more as it's an easy and effective way to help out our environment.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for dedicating the time to talk to us. And now, this is the end of our news for today. Good night all.
Hi everyone, I'm Alan Andrews from Client Earth. I'm here to talk about our legal action that we've been taking for the last couple of years to try and enforce these air quality standards that Ian and others have mentioned. So it's really interesting to hear Ian speak. It always inspires me and reminds me why we're doing the work we're doing. Ultimately it's about protecting human health. I'll just say a few words about, so I'll get out of the way of the slides. A few words on Client Earth, who we are and what we do. We describe ourselves as activist lawyers. So we work on environmental issues that we care about and we think are important. We're not like a law firm in that we don't have fee-paying clients and work on their behalf. It's really corny, I know, but we kind of see the Earth and its oceans and its air and its trees as our client. But unfortunately, tuna and trees don't really pay very well, so we have to go and get philanthropic foundations to fund us. So big, wealthy charities and individuals fund the work that we do. And we work across a range of environmental issues, forests, fisheries, biodiversity, but my specialism is air quality. And for the past 3 years, we've been focused on working in London. I just like using this photo. Normally it's this, air pollution is this invisible problem, but every now and then we get an episode like this that makes it all too visible, and that's when everyone starts getting very excited about it and talking about it, which is, from our point of view, quite welcome. The original aim of the project was to ensure full compliance in London with all air quality limits by the time of the Olympic Games, but with a couple of weeks to go, I'm starting to accept that we've probably missed out on that one, but we'll keep plugging away anyway. And for the last couple of years, the main thing we've been doing is bringing litigation. We've been going to court to actually try and enforce these limits. And to do that, we've been using a process called judicial review. It's a legal process by which you can challenge the decision of a public authority, where it's been made in non-compliance with the law or without following the correct procedure. So any public body, whether that's a government department or a local authority, for example, must act within the law. And the relevant law here is the Air Quality Directive, or to give it its full title, it's the Directive 2008-50 EC for ambient air quality and cleaner air for Europe. Is that about right? Catchy. So I'll just call it the Air Quality Directive for short. And the main thing it does is it sets limits on these levels of air pollution, as I'm sure you've heard. People often talk about targets. As a lawyer and a bit of a nerd, I get a bit wound up because they're not targets. When we talk about the limits for PM10 and for NO2, they're not targets, they're legally binding limits, and it's an important distinction. If you miss a target, there's no real sort of comeback. Whereas if you miss a limit, we have a right to go to court and enforce compliance with that limit. So it's a crucial distinction. Member states, including the UK, must monitor their air quality to make sure that it complies with these limits. Where they find that it doesn't, they must come up with air quality plans containing measures which will actually tackle the problem. And they must consult the public on the content of those plans and then submit them to the European Commission, who have a role in supervising them and ensuring that they're up to scratch. Unfortunately, this directive also introduced a provision for time extensions. So where member states were struggling to actually meet these limits, they could apply to the European Commission for a time extension. The PM10, they could extend up to 2011, so that's gone. But for nitrogen dioxide, there is a provision which allows them to extend until 2015, provided they come up with one of these air quality plans, which shows how they'll actually achieve compliance by that date. And again, they must submit that to the Commission, who must approve before they can have this time extension. And this is the name of our case. It's the Queen on the application of Client Earth versus Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. I'm sure you recognise the lady on the left. I'm not exactly sure why. I think I must have missed the lecture where they explained to us why judicial reviews are brought on behalf of the Crown. But but it's kind of nice to know that the Queen's on your side. The lady on the right, I honestly didn't do this deliberately, but every single picture I have of Caroline Spellman, she's sneering and looking really evil. It's honestly not deliberate. This is actually from her website. She's just got one of those faces. So, Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs is responsible under the Air Quality Directive and the regulations which implement that. She is responsible for ensuring compliance with these limits. She's also responsible for drawing up these air quality plans and implementing the measures that we need to achieve compliance. And these were the grounds for our judicial review. The first one was a slightly minor procedural point, but one that we felt was really important. There was an amendment to the PM10 plan for London, and they refused to hold a public consultation on it, saying that it was only a minor amendment and not something they had to bother the public about. And that's something that really winds us up at Client Earth, because we really believe in the right of the public to participate in plans that affect the environment. The second one, though, is the main one. It's that they failed to produce plans which achieve compliance with NO2 limits by 2015. And I'll explain a bit more about what we mean by that in a second. On that minor ground, this PM10 consultation, they conceded about a month before we went to court on that one. So we got an early victory, which is important to us, because it really defended this idea that if we have an air quality plan, we all have a right to see what's in it and comment on it and really feed in our ideas about what should be in it. But unfortunately, the main part of our claim they were never really going to concede on. So we went to court on that one, and I'll tell you about that in a bit more detail. It really all started back in early 2010. The limit value for nitrogen dioxide came into force on 1st January 2010. And using information from Ian's colleagues at the London Air Quality Network, we knew that the hourly limit for nitrogen dioxide had been breached within the first 3 weeks of 2010. This is Madame Tussauds, which is kind of where the camera is in relation to that photo, is where big monitoring station on Marylebone Road is. And that's what the government used to submit its data to the European Commission. It's really their super site for monitoring air quality. But Marylebone Road is not the worst when it comes to NO2. This is Brixton Road in Lambeth, where NO2 is often triple legal limits. And Putney High Street in Wandsworth is another where levels are similar to Brixton. So it was on this basis, faced with this kind of information, we realised we needed to take legal action to try and enforce these limits. And we did that in, let's see, it was probably about September 2011. We wrote to the government and said, look, we're aware that nitrogen dioxide is breached throughout London. What are you going to do about it? If you don't come up with some air quality plans showing how you're going to address the situation, we're going to take you to court. And their response was, yes, we accept there's a problem with NO2 in London. Yes, we accept that it's well over the legal limits, but we are working on an air quality plan. We're working on it now, and we're going to produce it in spring 2011, and that's going to show how we'll achieve compliance by 2015, and we're going to submit it to the European Commission and get a time extension. So we thought, okay, let's wait and see what happens. Let's see what this plan contains, and then we'll take it from there. We eventually got the plans, not when they said that we'd get them, but about 6 months later, as usual. And they were quite startling, actually. We'd always known that NO2 wasn't just a London problem. It's a national problem, albeit one that's most acute here in the capital. The government's plans show that the UK is divided into 43 zones for the purposes of monitoring air quality. 40 of those were in breach of the NO2 limits in 2010. I think the only ones that weren't are the Highlands of Scotland. Whatever this one is here, I'm not sure, I think it's called Grampian or something like that, but obviously not exactly highly densely populated areas. And for some reason Blackpool has got good air quality, I have no idea why. Maybe it's the trams, the sea breeze, I'm not sure. But anyway, obviously a national problem affecting most major urban areas in the UK. But the bit that really surprised us was that, contrary to what DEFRA had told us, these plans didn't achieve compliance by 2015 for 17 of these air quality plans. Most of them showed they'd not achieved compliance until about 2020. In the case of London, though, it wouldn't show compliance until 2025. And when you actually look at this air quality plan, we were expecting at least some new measures, some new thinking, some kind of real bold steps to try and tackle the problem. But we saw none of that. Really, the plan is a plan to do nothing. All they've done is bring together a load of plans, some dating back 5, 10 years, pulled them all together into one big document and told us how difficult it is to sort the situation out. So, faced with what we saw as a real failure to address the problem, we thought we had to push on and actually proceed with litigation. And that's just a list of these 17 zones, and you'll see it's most of the big cities in the UK. I'll just skip past that one. Okay, remedies. When we go to court, what are we actually asking for? Well, I should stress we're not asking for fines, we're not asking for compensation or anything like that. We don't want the government or anyone else to waste money. We want all the money that's there to be going on measures to actually tackle the problem. And so what we're asking for is the court to declare a couple of things. One, that the UK is actually in breach of its EU law obligations. Second, that these plans for these 17 zones don't do what they're supposed to. But the really important one is we're actually asking for a court order which will force DEFRA to come up with a new set of plans which will contain measures to achieve compliance by 2015. Now, when you start litigating, you go into a procedure called the pre-litigation process. So both sides, to stop any sort of shenanigans and skullduggery by lawyers, you enter into a sort of gentleman's kind of process where you have to share all your arguments with the other side in the court. So before you even set foot in court, you know what the other side's arguments are and you can respond to them. And this was what DEFRA's response was. Contrary to what they told us, they weren't going to apply for time extensions for these 17 zones. They decided it was just impossible to achieve compliance by 2015. So instead, they were relying on Article 23 of the directive, which is, people often talk about loopholes in law, and I think this is a classic example of one. Article 23 says, if you breach the limits after the deadline, you must come up with an air quality plan, and that shall set out appropriate measures so that the exceedance period can be kept as short as possible. Unfortunately, it doesn't define what short as possible means. So they were saying, well, as short as possible, in this case, is 2025. You can possibly do it any other than that. So, we got to respond with what we thought of their case. And our argument was this: all right, okay, as short as possible isn't defined, but if you look at the whole directive, it's pretty obvious that can't mean later than 2015. The absolute end date that you can achieve compliance, even with this time assumption, is 2015. We also said that compliance by 2015 is possible, or at least you've not proven to us that it isn't possible, because you've not actually even tried. You've not come up with a plan showing how you might achieve compliance. And also there's the mayor's, I've mentioned the mayor's air quality strategy there. It actually set out a list of 14 measures that it felt the national government had to take in order to address the NO2 problem. And so we were a bit surprised that none of them were referred to or included in the government's plans. So these are the arguments that we took to court, and the case was heard by the High Court, sitting in the Royal Courts of Justice just down the road on the Strand. And the case was heard by Mr. Justice Mitten. It was a one-day hearing, probably not all that dramatic if you were watching from the gallery, but quite compelling nonetheless. And we scored an important victory in that we forced the government to admit that they were in breach of their EU law obligations. Until then, what they'd said is, okay, we'll hold our hands up, we're in breach of all these limits, but that doesn't mean we've done anything wrong. You've only done anything wrong if you breach the limits and then don't come up with an air quality plan. We've come up with a plan, so there's no problem. Just admitting wasn't having any of that at all, and forced them to concede that they were actually breaking the law. But the real disappointment was that we didn't succeed in our main argument. This idea that the court had to step in, take action to force the government to clean up air pollution. He said, well, there's no requirement to produce a time extension. It's not mandatory. You can do what DEFRA have done. You can just come up with an air quality plan showing compliance basically whenever you decide. And if there's a problem with that, it's for the European Commission to take action, not for national courts. Now this was just absolutely ludicrous. It's completely wrong. Anyone an undergraduate law student who'd done 2 weeks study of European law will tell you that is wrong. But he obviously didn't want anything to do with this case. He was scared by I imagine he was scared by some of the numbers that were involved. DEFRA put forward estimates of some of the costs involved. And they're significant, we're talking hundreds of millions of pounds in investing in clean transport infrastructure. So he just dismissed the case with what's called an extempore judgment. He just read out a judgment that he'd written previously. And so that was very disappointing. But crucially, we got that one thing. We forced them to accept that they were in breach of the law. So the judge described it as a draw, and I think that's probably fair. We both won on each point. Just to stretch the sporting analogy, in law, as in sport, if you have a draw, you can't have a replay. So we were able to apply to the Court of Appeal and ask for permission to appeal, which was granted. So we got a second crack at it in May this year, where we went to the Court of Appeal and brought pretty much the same arguments in front of 3 Lord Justices of Appeal this time. This handsome chap is Lord Justice Laws. He was very much the head honcho. He was the senior judge on that panel of 3. And unfortunately, it didn't go our way again. We'd argued that national courts must enforce EU law. They must provide effective remedies where there's been a breach. And again, we asked for this court order requiring compliance by 2015. But we suffered a fairly heavy loss. Again, the appeal was dismissed on the day. It was even worse this time in terms of the fact that the judges had clearly made their mind up before. I mean, you actually saw them reading out a pre-prepared written statement. It took them about 10 minutes of deliberation before they dismissed the appeal. And the really disappointing bit from our point of view was they never really addressed this question of what does as short a time as possible mean? It just wasn't answered. It's not been answered by either court. I mean, it must mean something. If it doesn't mean by 2015, as we say, well then what does it mean? Can the government just decide what as short a time as possible means? Surely not. So we're not quite dead yet. The case lives on, albeit on life support. Here is the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. That's where we will be going next. Next week we'll be filing our applications to the Supreme Court. And what we'll be asking for, this time we want a reference. We want the Supreme Court to refer this question to the European Court in Luxembourg. They're the ultimate authority on matters of EU law. So we want the Supreme Court to say, okay, how does this directive work? How does it fit together? Does as short a time as possible mean 2015? And we'll also be trying to get a ruling on this idea that national courts can just pass the buck and lay the blame on the Commission, because that's just wrong. Unfortunately, in the last week, we actually got a letter from the European Commission, which was very helpful. It said, we've been following your case with interest, blah, blah, blah. We are very concerned that the national courts in the UK seem to think that it's not their job to enforce listed a whole load of case authorities which were very helpful to us. So we're obviously going to waive this in front of the Supreme Court and show them that they need to take some action where the lower courts have failed. In the meantime, a second front is opened up in this battle, if you like. This is an extract from the government's Red Tape Challenge section on the environment. If you're not familiar with it, the Red Tape Challenge was this exercise that the government have come up with to try and cut red tape, which they think is stifling economic growth and hampering business. And they came out with a series of proposals on how they could cut red tape within environmental regulation. And sure enough, as everyone who knew anything about environmental law told them, there's actually not really much you can do because most of our environmental law comes from Europe. And so we're pretty much stuck with it unless you want to try and renegotiate it. So they said, in the air quality section, we're going to work with our partners in other member states to use the 2013 review of the Air Quality Directive to reduce the infraction risk faced by most member states, especially in relation to NO2. And this sets alarm bells ringing, because how are you going to reduce the infraction risk? By that I mean the risk that Client Earth or the European Commission will take them to court. How do you reduce that risk without fundamentally weakening these legal standards that we have in place? And how are they going to do that? Are they going to lower the limits? Or sorry, raise the limits? Or are they going to turn them, these legally binding limits, into some kind of non-binding target? Really worrying stuff. So while we're still going to push ahead with this case, our attention also has to shift to Brussels, where in 2013, the Air Quality Directive and all European pollution legislation is being reviewed. So I'm probably going to have to move to Brussels next year, which is, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Good beer as well. And we're going to have to work with the European Parliament, with the European Commission, to try and ensure that the legal protections we have in place stay that way. But we'll have a big job on our hands. So just to wrap up, I think the government have got their head in the sand when it comes to air pollution. They don't want to really tackle this problem. It's difficult, it's complex, and it's expensive, and they just do not want to spend any money in this current economic climate, which I think is very short-sighted. We've heard all about the health impacts of air pollution. They have a real cost on human lives, which actually the bean counters, the economists can actually put numbers on. They can tell you that, for example, every year air pollution costs UK society between 12 and 18 billion pounds. So there's a very real cost. We've got a right to clean air, albeit a very flimsy right. I think it's a right that's really in its infancy, it's embryonic. So it's really important that we try and defend that right and don't let. We make sure that the courts enforce the right, and we make sure that governments aren't allowed to water it down. That's about it. I'll take any questions then.
Well, now we have Dr. Ian Mudway from the MRC-HPA Centre for Environment and Health in King's College London, and you're going to tell us about why air pollution is bad for human health.
Okay, I have slides, so you have to excuse me. I have probably far too many of them, and it's going to be a little bit London-centric too, maybe a bit of the States and the world issues as well. I want to give you a background, kind of historical context. I know you've probably learned much of the historical context before about the smogs and how we discovered the fine particles were potentially damaging to health. But I think it's important because many of the lessons, many of the key features which came out of the original studies of the smogs in the 1950s are still with us in terms of who dies, what they die of, who the sensitive individuals are. And so it's pertinent to review those before we go on to talk about what London is like at the current time. So I'm going to start off with the London smog. This is obviously quite famous. We know clearly that during the period in early December when we have the build-up of black smoke and sulfur dioxide, thousands of additional people died. When you think of this as being black smoke, But I wanted to make one point about this, which is you think about black smoke and you think now about PM10 and 2.5. And the assumption is that this is a really large carbonaceous material in the air. If you take autopsy samples of lungs from people who died during the smog in 1952, and you look at them microscopically, the particles you can see in the embedded lung tissues are micrometer-sized particles. So this episode wasn't just large carbonaceous material from sulphurous coal, it also had PM10 in it. It had a lot of PM2.5 in it. A lot of the PM contained metal species, and you can actually see them accumulating in the lung sections of people who died in 1952, and around those accumulations of particles you can see massive inflammation in the lungs and tissue injury. So the actual pathology exists to say that particles were causing inflammation and tissue injury in these individuals. And the next slide is simply an illustration of the number of people who died in the concentration, so I'll go past that. Because I wanted to just, if I can, go to this, which is the question of who died. And this is still a pertinent question. Clearly the story, the sort of anecdotal reporting which goes on with 1952 tells you the people who died were the elderly with pre-existing cardiovascular and pulmonary conditions. In fact, many of the people who died of bronchitis, and certainly symptomatically bronchitis was the major thing people were turning up in the hospitals and complaining of. But this looks at the ratios of people who died in the week before and the week after the episode, stratified by age. And I just wanted to put this up because it makes a simple point. Yes, there was a doubling, almost a threefold increase in mortality rate in the elderly, and the elderly are a sensitive group. One of the things which happens to us as we enter the third, if you like, portion of our life, second class, 50, 60, 70, is that we get less good at dealing with stresses. We become more sensitive. When we're young, we can tolerate a lot of stresses in the environment. That's why people who are young can smoke. People who are older begin to see symptomatic responses because their bodies get worse at defending themselves. The inflammation doesn't die down after they smoked. Their capacity of their cells to repair decreases. So that final, if you like, third of life is a critical period. We are more sensitive as individuals. But the thing which is highlighted here is this. It's very often not stated about the 52 smogs. The children under 12 months were the other group of individuals where there was an increased mortality rate. So we're looking at the very, very young and the old. And back in 1952, we already had identified that the elderly and the young were at increased risk of premature mortality. And the problem about all of this, of course, is that we have this obsession, and it's probably a dangerous obsession, I think we mentioned it, with the headline figure of mortality. Because mortality is, if you like, the pinnacle of the health pyramid. It's as bad as it's going to get. We also have to consider the other aspects which affect large proportions of the population. So if we have a small number of people who are dying because of an episode, underpinning that we have an increased number of people who suffer worsening of the symptoms of the pre-existing diseases that they have. They may have to have hospital admissions, they may have to have increased medications. We may see increased doctor visits. We may see people with conditions such as asthma having more attacks, requiring more medication. That's a larger proportion of the population. And then right down here is the really critical one. Because I can guarantee, having come in on the tube today, that my lungs are inflamed. I can guarantee it because I know what the science is behind it. We, as we move through the city, will be suffering from what we call subclinical effects in our lungs. There will be some inflammation. We'll have some small changes in our lung function. And they're sort of subclinical in most of us, especially in the adult population. We're not necessarily aware they're there. But the presence of them occurring daily, over years, it's the irritation within the lung which causes, if you like, you refer to it as life shortening. Another way of looking at it is a premature aging of the respiratory system, a premature aging of the cardiovascular system, which makes you, if you like, more susceptible to an earlier death later in life. So this down here, these effects which affect millions of people, should not be forgotten when we start talking about the years of lost life at the top of this pyramid. Both are important. And to illustrate that again, we don't have to go back too far. 1952, again, hospital admissions, forget the 4,000 people who died, hospital admissions across London increased by 50%. Again, respiratory admissions increased by 160%. So the quality of life of the residents in these air pollution episodes is also critical, as well as the economic loss of output from people who aren't working, people who are absent from schools, people who are absent from the workplace. Clearly, we always say London smog was resolved in air nats, and then the nature of air pollution changed as we had increasing traffic. I'll just make the point, there are still places in the world which has air pollution which is completely comparable to the 1952 smogs. You go to the developing world, if you go to India, if you go to some countries in South America, the same conditions pertain as pertained in 1952. So whilst in the UK we can say many of these pollutants went down, it's not a worldwide phenomenon. So globally we can't ignore the fact that many people still live in conditions like the London population used to experience. The reason I wanted to highlight traffic is I wanted to take you through again some important data which led us to believe that the fine particles in traffic had a health effect. And so I'm going to review very quickly the data from the 6 Cities study. And I think it's really important because it's often quoted, but people haven't really gone through the paper carefully to understand exactly what that paper is actually talking about. So I thought I'd do that for you, so you could see where this data came from and what it actually looks like and how robust it is. So the 6 Cities study, well, the paper was published as a landmark paper in New England Journal of Medicine in 1993. Looked at mortality. It also looked at morbidity, hospital beds, but it looked at mortality predominantly in 6 communities within the United States from the mid-70s until the late 80s. Across here we have the concentrations of different types of pollutions which were measured over that extended period. So this is sort of like a 16-year average. Okay? So you have Steubenville and St. Louis, which are very industrialized areas. You can see they have high levels of particles, total particles, fine particles, PM 2.5 microns, and sulfate particles. And right at the bottom you have Topeka and Portage, which are relatively clean, rural, if you like, cities if you like, and you can see the concentrations are much lower. So in this study what they looked at was the probability of dying over that 16-year period. And so what I'm going to show you next is a probability curve. How likely were you to die over that period for each of these cities? And this is the first bit of the data which isn't shown. And what we're looking at here is your probability of surviving for the population within each of those cities. And right at the top I can actually indicate this to make it easier for you. These are the cleanest cities. These are the dirty cities, Steubenville and St. Louis. Your probability of survival is way down here, compared with the cleaner cities. So you try to animate these things, it goes all well. Whereas if you go to the polluted cities, you can see the difference. The chances of dying prematurely are much higher in the industrial cities in the States over this period than in the more rural locations. And what they did from that is they then looked at your odds of dying in relation to the pollution over those cities over the period of time. And that's where these famous graphs come from. There is no more famous graph in air pollution than this one. Okay? And the reason this is so important is when you do science on large populations, nothing ever falls on a nice and simple straight line. Yeah? What you get is a cloud of data, and somebody like me standing in front of you saying there's a pattern in this cloud of data, and you all sit there and go, I can't see it to be quite honest, but I'll take your word for it. But this is amazing, because here we have, let's look at the fine particles, here we have Portage, here we have the increased chance. So what they've said is, this is your chance of dying in Portage over that period. When we set that as a value of 1, what's your increased percentage chance of dying in the other locations? And you can see it's 30%, about 30% more likely to die prematurely in Steubenville, the polluted environment, than in Portage. And look at this linear relationship. It's absolutely phenomenal. This was really the study which made people take note of the fine particles, which led to the interest in traffic and the impact of traffic on people's health. Initially this was really thinking about industrial emissions, but it didn't take long to go from PM 2.5 to traffic particles. The other thing about this finding is it's incredibly robust. Wherever you look for this association, you find this association. The magnitude of the association may differ between different places, but the association exists between mortality and exposure to fine particles, to NO2. And the NO2 data is really interesting. Now, I know many of us in this room are interested in NO2. NO2 is a huge challenge for us. Yeah? Because when you look at it in terms of toxicology, you would say it's not toxic at the levels we breathe. But when you look at the population epidemiology, there's clear evidence that people are dying prematurely from NO2 at concentrations currently below the WHO guideline levels. And there's this mismatch between what I'm going to talk about later on, science and humans, experimental science, and what actually goes on in the real world, which means there are things we don't understand about NO2, which we still need to think about. People who die, this is interesting, the people who are dying of COPD, bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. COPD is the disease, I always find, I study COPD, so the general population ignorance about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which very shortly will become the third largest killer of people in the world, okay, in the next 10 years. But people don't know about that, and they focus on cardiovascular and cancer risk is amazing. But COPD, patients with bronchitis or emphysema, were the ones who were dying prematurely. Pneumonia was highlighted, though it wasn't significant, and here we have cardiovascular disease. So these are the individuals who seem to be dying prematurely in these cities. Having said that, that's the setting scene. You were talking about your report and the exceedances of NO2. My children go to haberdashers in central London. I live in New Cross, so every morning I have to walk them up that hill. And from that hill every morning, I can look down across the whole of London. Now this isn't my picture, somebody sent this to our blog in October of last year, and you can see the city. There's the wheel there, you can just, you can see the inversion layer of NO2 sitting over the whole city. And I see this inversion layer, I see it every single day, unless it's raining. Every time I drop my children off, I look over down the hill, and you can see London bathed in this ocean of brown nitrogen dioxide. So to a certain extent, for me, it's actually much more physically visible than just actually relying on the measurements from the actual traffic sites. We are living within a traffic-derived soup. The problem is, and I do a lot of education for children, is how you convince them of that, when actually, as they walk down the street, they can perceive nothing. They can't see the brown gases, they can't see the particles. But this is just to say, look, it's here. You don't have to imagine it. Take people who don't believe you up a hill in London on a clear day and make them look down at the city. It's the most arresting physical demonstration you can give them of the air quality issues London faces. I am an experimental scientist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a modeler. Okay? I like to see what happens when people are breathing pollution. And some of the experiments I've done, okay, may sound a bit strange. But what I do is I work with colleagues in Sweden and we expose individuals to pollutant. Now we do it in northern Sweden, a place called Umeå, big university town, but way, way north. It's like 1.5 hour flight north of Stockholm. The air there is incredibly clean, which means we can take these individuals and expose them to the levels of diesel they would experience walking down the road in central London, and then we can see what that does to their airways. In a way we couldn't do in London, because by the time we took you to a chamber in London, you probably already would have breathed that concentration, so we wouldn't see any effects over the body. So what we have here, this is a happy Scandinavian medical student in a box, on an exercise bicycle, doing some exercise. And over here, behind this wall, here we have a lovely Volvo diesel engine, producing diesel, and then that gets shunted through here. This is a big tube, and we dilute the diesel exhaust, of course, because it's not like an animal study we're seeing how what the dose is to kill people. So we dilute it, and we feed it into this chamber, and the concentrations, we've done a range of concentrations, but a lot of our work's been done at 300, which is quite high, although if you walk down a busy road in London, as a personal exposure, you can attain that, and 100 micrograms per meter cube. These people are exercising, but there they are, they're being exposed. So what happens when you're breathing diesel exhaust? And this diesel exhaust is PM. Actually, it's ultrafine PM, because the particles coming from the diesel engine in these exposures are about 30 to 80 nanometers. So very, very fine particles, a lot of carbonaceous material, but also a big slug of NO2. So it's kind of a co-exposure. And what I wanted to show to you was these concentrations have a real effect in your lungs. And that's important because otherwise you can align the health effects people report in populations to what you're really breathing. So, here's a picture of the lung. Okay? So here we have our conducting airways. I've got the alveolar areas down here. And what we do is we expose them, and if that wasn't bad enough, then we take them into the clinic and we perform bronchoscopy on them. which means we pass a tube, fibre optic tube, into their lung, usually down into the first branch, second branch, third or fourth branch of the airways. And then we kind of wash the surface of the airway. We can bring some liquid back which tells us what's on the surface of the airway. Or it's got a little hole in it with a claw. So we can come down, we can pull a piece of tissue out. Okay? This does not hurt because you have no pain receptors in your lungs. And I have had this done on myself. The only strange sensation is you can feel your lungs moving in your chest cavity, which is a bit eeky. Anyway, so we've taken out a piece of tissue, we fixed it in a resin block, and we've sliced it very, very thinly, and now we can see what's happening in that tissue. So the individuals, we expose them twice. Once to very clean air, and once to our diesel exhaust. What you're looking at here, this is the sort of like the surface of the airway, and underneath you have this sort of like, it's called the submucosa. It's kind of like a tissue matrix which the cells stick to on the lung. And what we've done is we've stained certain cells within this tissue section, and these cells are neutrophils. Now neutrophils, I always regard as being like the infantry of the immune system, okay? They are recruited when there's injury, they're packed full of dangerous cytotoxic materials to kill bacteria. So you don't really want huge amounts of neutrophils moving into a tissue without there being an appropriate stimuli. What we can see is in air, you have a few of these brown spots which are neutrophils, and after they've been exposed to diesel, you have a lot more. So there's a huge inflammation in the airway which occurs acutely after these individuals have been exposed to diesel. And we see this even at 100 micrograms per meter cubed. So inflammation is occurring. And when inflammation occurs, you get tissue injury, and when you get tissue injury, then you begin to have structural changes occurring in the lung. Now the next thing is just how the data looks when you put it into paper. It's much less interesting. But what you can see over here, this is the epithelium of the lung, which is this bit. This is the submucosa. And what you're looking at is this is after air, this is diesel. You see most of the lines going up, which means most of these individuals have more neutrophils in their airway after they've been exposed to diesel. And then this is a really interesting one down here. You can't really see it, but this is in blood, which means the inflammation after they had breathed the diesel was not simply restricted to their lungs. It was affecting the whole cardiovascular system. They had inflammation systemically. So, again, this is important because we know that many of the people who die when they're exposed to NO2 PM seem to be dying of worsenings of their cardiovascular conditions. So, as context, the pollution does something. It really causes harmful changes to the airways, which you can see experimentally without any confounding or anything you can't understand. Of course, that's a chamber. Now, this is a study which was done by colleagues at Imperial, and this is kind of a real-world equivalent, because the pollution in the real world is different. In fact, it's very difficult to pin down exactly what it is all of the time, because it's very, very complicated. But here, a study was done in asthmatics, where they made use of the fact that Oxford Street was a diesel-only thoroughfare, and they walked the asthmatics up and down this road. They also got the asthmatics to walk around the round pond in Hyde Park. And there are differences in the concentrations of pollutants. So if we look at some of the concentrations here, in Hyde Park, PM10 is about 72 micrograms per meter cubed, PM2.5, 11.2. We go over here, PM10 Oxford is 125, 28. So 125 micrograms, that's more than my human challenge studies at 100 where we showed inflammation. And what they were able to show in this study is when they looked at the asthmatics, they actually could see physiologic changes. So here, they're looking at a measurement of lung function. How much air you can blow out of your lungs in a 1-second maneuver. It tells you something about the compliance of the areas. And we can see here is Oxford, this is Hyde Park. This is what happens as they walk along Oxford Street. They have this loss of lung function, and it doesn't actually recover up to 7 hours after the end of that walk down the street. With this study, because they had asthma, they had many more subjects than we had in our chambers, they couldn't do bronchoscopies. So instead they did something which is known as induced sputum. You sort of like spray a hypertonic saline. It causes you to cough up a big blob of mucus. You can do a lot with mucus when you get out of the lung, believe me. So what they've done here is they've looked at something which will tell them whether the upper airways are inflamed. And they've measured a compound called myeloperoxidase. Now, myeloperoxidase is contained in granules of neutrophils, and when neutrophils are angry and killing tissue, they release myeloperoxidase. So if you see an increase in myeloperoxidase, it means the neutrophils are there, and they're activated, and they're causing harm. What you can see here is if you take all of the asthmatics, Hyde Park versus Oxford Street, you can see they have upper airway inflammation. Walking down the street with high diesel in the real world. So inflammation is occurring. And this inflammation is really the basis of the health effects we see from people who are exposed to air pollution. And if you think about the long-term effects, it's because you have recurrent cycles of inflammation occurring every day, which then result in structural changes, sensitization of the areas, and premature aging of tissues. The other thing I wanted to make was that some people would say these studies are fine, but we're really talking about microenvironments. When we talk about the epidemiological studies, they're usually using models, or they're relating health effects to pollution concentrations measured at background sites in cities. And pollutant concentrations of traffic fall off quite quickly from the road. So this is just to illustrate, here we have a hypothetical busy road. This is the concentration of NO2, concentration of fine particles, the concentration of ultrafine particles. And what it says is, as you move away from the road, very rapidly these concentrations fall. So, within 50 metres you can see it's falling. Within 100 metres, we can see we still have elevated concentrations. And when we present work about London to Americans, they say, well, it's fine. Who lives within 100 metres of a busy road? And so we showed them this. And we say, these are the postcodes of the entire hamlets only, which are within 100 metres of a busy road. And in America, there are restrictions on whether you can build within 500 metres of a busy road. Nobody in this particular picture of Tower Hamlets or Hackney lives less than 500 metres away from a busy road. So all of these people who are exposed to that brown soup, they are all exposed to high levels of pollution. And the reason I've highlighted this is because I've done lots of work, I'll talk about it very briefly in Tower Hamlets, but sometimes you think, well, who lives there? How many people live there? Well, here we are, this is just coming out of the Blackwall Tunnel here, go around this roundabout where we've seen some of the highest concentrations we've ever measured in personal monitoring, and there's a whacking great big estate. So lots of people are exposed at these locations, and it's slap bang on the roundabout. And as you go up the road towards the Olympic site, you can see all the new builds they've put on some of the most polluted roads in London, despite the fact that we know what the associations are. So lots of people live within these microenvironments. I can only tell you briefly, we've done some studies in this area. So we go into schools, and we've been doing this for 4 years now. Now this began as a study to investigate whether the LEZ was going to improve children's health, which is rather compromised when the Mayor cancelled the stage of the LEZ that we were going to study. So it's now been extended 2 more years after January of this year. But we go to schools, and all these dots are different schools in Tower Hamlets and Hackney. And if you know the areas, you'll see that, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of these schools are slap bang on some of the busiest roads in London. I mean, really right on them. I often think you wouldn't get permission to build the schools there now, and then I come across a school where somebody has built a new school slap bang on a busy road, so that rather destroys it. We go into the schools, we do lung function testing on the children. We look at the gases they breathe out, because some of those will tell us whether they have inflammation in the airways. We take swabs to get DNA from them, because we want to know whether they have subtle variations in their genes, which may make them more or less sensitive. And we take urine from them to see whether we can measure markers of inflammation or oxidative stress. We do a whole lot of information in these studies, and we are trying to link that to their actual exposures to PM10, PM2.5, and NO2. Now I can't tell you the data because it's all being worked, but I will say we are already seeing in the first 4 years of the study evidence that children who live in the more polluted areas have lower lung function. So there is an evidence of an effect within this area. And for a while when I was doing this, thought we might not see the type of results they'd seen in the American studies, because of all our children have exposures which are at the very far end of the American exposures in their study. They have a much wider range of exposures to their children. All our children have high exposures. So, it's difficult to see that sort of gradient. But this work is ongoing, so that we can see what happens when LEZ phase 3 and 4 have begun to manifest. So hopefully we'll see something like that. We are doing baseline analysis of this right at this time. The other thing I wanted to illustrate is we've been doing lots and lots of work trying to understand what children are actually exposed to in the real world. And so what we've been doing is actually walking their routes to school. So what we do is we go to the school, we find out where their home postcode is, the school, then we then use GIS to calculate the routes they work, get them to confirm that they walk those routes, and then when we do these school visits, me and my colleague usually turn up about 5:30 in the morning and we walk all these routes. And this is just an illustration of the sort of data we can get. This is a machine which measures particle number concentration, which people think is increasingly important in terms of the cardiovascular effects of heart attack. And we can also measure this little blue box, black carbon. And what I have here is just an illustrative set of data from a visit we did at the John Cass School, which is located slap bang in the middle of Aldgate roundabout. So some of the highest concentrations we've measured of pollution in schools were at that site. And you can see we've done 3 routes. We can see we have this route here which looks relatively low, you see the peaks are lower, and this one which is higher. This little dip here is walking up Brick Lane at about 7:30 in the morning, very little traffic. This huge exposure on this route is as you swing down into Wapping. And we've collected a huge amount of data over the last year, mapping out these school routes and looking at the exposures to the children, which again, we're in a position of analysing. So I can't show you any real data, but I can tell you we've certainly walked about 300 kilometres of school walks and collected more data on personal exposure than anybody else in the world currently holds. So it's going to be an incredibly useful data set to understand how real exposures relate to effects which are measured acutely in these children. The other thing which I've been thinking about has arisen because of the amendment to our, we have an iPhone or an Android phone app, which has just been updated. And it's just been updated, so instead of giving you this old format of telling you these are the sites and these are the levels of pollutants, it now will give you a surface of London hour by hour, which will tell you what the concentrations are as a surface. So you can see where the high concentration roads are. And this, because of our work with school children, made us think, could we use this nowcast prediction to actually find alternative routes to move through the city to see if we can reduce our exposure to pollution? Because I can tell you the LEZ is going to have very little improvements on air quality. What would be the benefit of actually having informed usage of our city in terms of providing people with, or maybe even pedestrianised routes through the city so they could reduce their exposure? So using Nowcast, we actually did a little quick study where we just basically, well, I made a Dutch student walk from where I am based, in Franklin Wilkins building, and I made him walk to the British Library and back a lot of times. And the reason to the British Library is because they have a nice coffee shop. So, you know, I'm not completely mean to the student. So we made him walk a route which Nowcast predicted as being high consistently on all the days we did this, and we made him take an alternative route which was showing low pollution on Nowcast. Now, we thought, how much exposure will you save? What's the benefit of using this device to alter the way you move around the city? And this is very preliminary, but here we're just looking at black carbon. And effectively, we could reduce the individual's exposure to black carbon by 50% simply by changing the way they moved around the city, which is feeding into our idea that we may go into schools next year and get children to think about alternative routes that they can walk to school. Although it has to be said, having walked some of these routes, sometimes there is no alternative to them walking along a busy road. But nevertheless, I thought that this was an interesting system. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't regulate, we should just say, get on with it, and the city stays the same, and people should just be careful where they walk around the city. But I think providing people with short-term evidence like this, where they can reduce their exposures, whilst we deal with the policy issues, which are going to take a long time to turn the situation around, is actually a very useful thing to do. So we've quantified this for a lot of different endpoints now. We always see a considerable benefit. And I have a summary. Summary is sort of self-evident, really. If you're exposed to PM for long periods of time, it will impact on your cardiovascular system. Your system will degrade. I like the idea of talking about premature aging. People who smoke know their skin prematurely ages. People who are exposed to sunlight know their skin prematurely ages. Getting across to people that if you live in a condition of high pollution or you smoke, you have accelerated aging of your lung, I think is a message which helps to tie in with the fact that people then are dying prematurely. You shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the acute episodes still will kill people, acutely, who are already sensitized. So it's not just this long-term shortening of life, there are real critical acute effects as well which are happening within the population. If you reduce PM, I cut this slide out, you can see measurable effects. People went back to those 6 cities in the States and looked at what happened after the particle concentrations went down. And they showed that as pollution fell in those cities, so did the mortality rate. So if you can effectively reduce pollution, you can improve mortality rate. But more importantly, you can improve the quality of life of people with diseases and the quality of life of the general population. Again, thinking beyond just the headline mortality figure. Studies in experimental chambers or with people working in the real world actually support the health effects that the epidemiologists see. So this isn't some strange sort of science out there which people can question. There's real hard science of real toxic effects happening in the lung which support it. So that means that this is not soft science, this is robustly hard science. And then finally, you can actually reduce your exposure if you're supplied with the right level of information. But it's not an alternative to actually meeting your regulatory targets. During October, there was a fantastic email exchange which happened on one of our Twitter feeds. And I remember it because it was a really interesting one. And essentially, there was a pollution episode, and so the government had put out some advice that people should maybe not go out and ride their bikes or do too much exercise outside. To which we all thought, well, that makes sense. And somebody wrote in and they said, why is the advice that I shouldn't go out and ride my bike? Why isn't the advice that you shouldn't take your car out? Surely the advice should be, don't take your car out so that people who are living a healthy lifestyle and using the city actually can use the city. And it was an important issue. So I don't want to present this as being an alternative. It's an adduct to deal with the fact that the changes we want to see aren't going to happen.
Thank you very much. Brilliant.